If you want to quilt on your home domestic sewing machine, let me show you how I like to do it. This is part 4 of my 5-part series on how to make a quilt from start to finish, and we are going to be talking about quilting. In the previous part, we basted our quilt, which is putting those 3 layers together, the backing, the batting, and the quilt top. And now we are going to talk about how we quilt it. So these would be the stitches that go through all 3 layers to hold them together. My favorite tool for this part of the process is called a hero marker. And this is what it looks like. I prefer this over fabric markers because you don't have to wash them out. You don't have to worry about them staining your quilt. And you can kind of draw on the design to see what it would look like before doing it. So before you begin quilting, I want you to pick out a quilting design. You're more than likely going to want to just do straight stitches, especially if this is your first quilt, unless you know how to do free motion quilting. For this quilt, I just did horizontal lines about 1 inch apart, but you could also do like crisscross lines, which is called crosshatch, or vertical lines, or horizontal and vertical lines to make like a grid pattern. It is totally up to you how close together you want them to be. I would not go much further than, I don't know, maybe 2 inches if you're just doing lines in one direction. If you check out my Amazon storefront, there's a book called Walk on there, and there are a ton of ideas on how to quilt your quilts other than just vertical or horizontal lines. Personally, that's actually a look that I really like, but if you're looking for some inspiration, that is a great book to purchase. I highly recommend using what is called a walking foot for this part of the process. This is what it looks like, and I also have a guide bar that I'm inserting in there to help me space out my lines. But the walking foot is going to more evenly feed your fabric through your machine, causing less creases and other issues. I actually made my first maybe half a dozen quilts without a walking foot, and that is one of my biggest regrets. Definitely, it is worth the money. If you don't already have one, go get one. And it can feel a little weird at first when you first start using it, but you will very quickly get used to it and your quilt will turn out much better. Since I'm going to be putting this through a small machine, what I do is I roll up both sides, and I like to start at the center of the quilt for my stitch lines. And then I work my way outward. So like I said, I'm doing horizontal lines. So I actually found around the middle point of my quilt, and I'm going to begin stitching that way. The reason I'm rolling it up is because I have to fit it through the throat space on one side. And then on the other side, I like to have it rolled up so that it is not pulling on the quilt in the wrong direction. I chose a thicker thread for this quilt because I wanted a bolder stitch, and this is Aurifil in 28 weight, and it is kind of like an off-white color. Once you are ready to start quilting, you're going to want to remove whatever foot you already have on your machine and put on your walking foot. How to install the walking foot on your machine might vary a little bit from how I put on mine. So if you're unable to figure it out, definitely look up on the internet your machine model and then how to change out feet. So here I screw it in on the left side, just like I would with my other foot. But then on the right side, there is that little piece that you actually have to make sure is up and on that bar there. So here, that needs to be up there. Don't want that hanging down, or the walking foot is not going to work how it's supposed to. When I am ready to begin quilting, I bring my quilt over and then I start stitching right before where my quilt top starts. I don't need to stitch all the way on the end there because that will be trimmed off. And then I just start going. I very carefully start stitching through my quilt, and I stop and reposition my hands and the quilt whenever I need to. You can also use quilting gloves here to help you grip the quilt, and you will want to make sure that you're using a large workspace with room, if you can, on the back of your sewing machine so that it is not pulling the quilt through faster than it should be. If you want, you can also lengthen your stitch length. I'm using 3.5 here. I would strongly suggest maybe practicing a few different stitch lengths to see how it would look if you're unsure which to use. As I approach the end here, I go slightly off the quilt top and then cut my threads. And then I just remove the quilt, bring it back over by me, and then do the same process all over again on the next line. So like I said, I'm using a guide bar here. So I'm inserting my guide bar about 1 inch away from where my needle is. And then I use that guide bar to follow the previous stitch line, and I will keep continuing this process along the entire length of the quilt. working my way outward to the end, and then I will flip the quilt around and do the other side. Here I'm showing my throat space. I do have quite a bit of space on this machine, but I've made larger quilts on much smaller machines. It can be done. Make sure to remove pins if you have pins in your quilt as you go. Do not run over those big safety pins. And if there's a large hole, I find kind of like scratching the fabric and moving the fibers back in place should fix that. My last quick tip for this part of the process would be to wind up a bunch of bobbins with the thread you're using. This way, if you run out, you are ready to go and just continue on. Also check the bobbin thread often because there's nothing worse than being halfway through a stitch line and running out of thread.